By the time the teacups began to rattle, Eleanor Müller's hands had already betrayed her. The silver tray trembled once, then twice, a fine shiver running along its edge like light over water. A spoon chimed against porcelain. 3 ladies paused over sugared brioche, and Lady Vexley laughed first, loud enough to rescue the room from any danger of kindness. "There," she said, lifting her own cup with theatrical calm. "Our plain little stepdaughter announces herself before she enters. One never requires a bell while Miss Müller attends breakfast." Laughter followed in obedient ripples. Eleanor set the tray down carefully on the sideboard and kept her eyes lowered. She had learned over 2 years in this house that silence was treated as guilt, but speech as insolence, and guilt at least ended faster. At 22 she was old enough to have learned elegance, and too young, apparently, to have acquired it. Her dark hair was pinned so severely that her temples ached by noon. Anything softer was called vanity. Her face was pale, its bones fine and narrow, making her eyes appear larger than fashion permitted. Lady Vexley called her bloodless, then expensive, then ungrateful, sometimes all before breakfast. This had once been her father's dining room, not merely a room in which she had grown up, but one he had owned, improved, and argued in over tenant rents, canal shares, and pension schemes for men too old to work his lands. Now the Mayfair townhouse bore Lady Vexley's visiting cards on the hall table, and Lady Vexley's hand over every lock. The portrait of Eleanor's father had been moved from above the mantel to the morning room where no one looked at it, because, as Lady Vexley had remarked, one does not dine under reproach. "Miss Müller," Lady Vexley snapped her fingers as though calling a spaniel, "have you mislaid your hearing as well as your grace? Mrs. Pritchard says the butcher's account is absurd this month. Explain it!" Eleanor crossed to the table and accepted the folded bill. She did not need to read it. She had already corrected 2 false entries and 1 duplicated charge in the household books before dawn. "The increase is from game, my lady," she said. "For Thursday's dinner you ordered 6 partridges for 12 guests. The man delivered 8 and charged accordingly. I reduced the charge by 1 shilling where he counted liveries not sent." Lady Vexley narrowed her eyes, disliking competence almost as much as she disliked contradiction. "You are very bold for a girl who contributes nothing." Eleanor inclined her head. "Yes, my lady." She contributed nothing that could be seen from a card table. No dowry remained with her name on it. Her mother's people had died or vanished into the colonies before she came out of the schoolroom. A stepdaughter without money was household furniture, useful when polished, embarrassing when noticed. She endured because endurance required no witness, and because she had one inheritance no one had yet managed to strip from her, her father's certainty that numbers, like truths, could be made to confess if one stared long enough. So she counted in silence coal orders, candle wax, livery cloth, the suspiciously shrinking disbursement marked tenant relief in a hand she did not trust. At night, after the servants banked the kitchen fire and the townhouse settled into expensive sleep, she read legal scraps by candlelight from her father's old desk, Latin phrases copied in his blunt script, fragments of trust language, marginal notes that said things like, "Always compare duplicate books, and kindness without structure is theft by delay." By day she carried trays. By evening she stood behind chairs and listened to men discuss Parliament, as if no woman in the room possessed ears. Occasionally, when Lady Vexley felt playful, she reminded guests that Eleanor had a little education, absurdly encouraged by her father, and commanded her to translate a line of Virgil between courses, as one might command a bird to sing. If Eleanor did so accurately, there were jokes about governesses. If she faltered, there were jokes about female minds. What she feared most was not ridicule. Ridicule was weather. One endured it and went on. What she feared was marriage spoken of in the same practical tone as household coal. That tone arrived in March with rain stippling the front steps, and Lady Vexley in excellent spirits. "Tonight," she said, while Eleanor fastened an old garnet clasp at her throat. "You will smile if addressed, hold your shoulders back, and refrain from your country habits. Mr. Rook is expected." Eleanor's fingers stilled. "Mr. Rook from Holborn?" "The very same. A respectable man with interests in shipping insurance and a proper understanding of accounts. You should be grateful for his notice." He was a widower. He had 2 grown sons and a reputation for collecting debts, as if they were offences against his dignity. He smelled of clove lozenges and wet wool. He had once held Eleanor's hand too long when introduced and told her she would learn obedience quickly with the right household. Eleanor said nothing. Lady Vexley leaned in, her perfume sharp as crushed violets, and tightened the garnet clasp until the chain bit skin. "Do not be foolish," she murmured. "Girls in your position are not consulted, they are rescued." That evening the drawing-rooms filled with polished voices and candlelight reflected in gilt mirrors. Lady Vexley moved from group to group, trailing scandal and satisfaction. Eleanor poured wine, accepted shawls, answered when spoken to, and avoided Mr. Rook's orbit with the precision of someone crossing thin ice. At 10:30, just as a quartet in the music-room began a Handel arrangement no one was listening to, Lady Vexley struck her spoon against glass. My friends," she trilled, "before cards begin, permit me a domestic happiness. It delights me to announce the engagement of my dear stepdaughter, Miss Eleanor Müller, to Mr. Jonah Rook, whose prudence and character are known to all." Applause immediate and thoughtless. Faces turned. Someone said, "How fortunate!" Someone else, "So sensibly arranged." Mr. Rook bowed toward Eleanor with proprietary warmth. She did not remember crossing the room. One moment she was standing beneath the chandelier with blood roaring in her ears. The next, she was in the conservatory, damp air pressing cool against her face through glass beaded with rain. Ferns loomed darkly in blue pots. Beyond the panes, Mayfair lamps blurred into smeared gold. She braced one hand against the window frame. Her other hand would not unclench. Footsteps approached, unhurried. She expected a maid or Lady Vexley's hissed command to return smiling. Instead, a man's voice spoke at her shoulder, low and precise. "Miss Müller." She turned. Lord Ashbourne stood in the doorway, all severe lines and winter stillness. She knew him by sight only, an earl with too much money and too little patience for conversation, reputed to leave assemblies early and charities to his solicitors. His dark coat carried the cold from outside. His gaze dropped once, not to her face but to her fingers gripping the sill hard enough to whiten the knuckles. "Why are you trembling?" he asked. Eleanor forced her hand flat against the wood. "I am not trembling," she lied. His eyes lifted to hers. They were grey, unreadable, and not unkind. Up close she looked younger than 22 and far more tired. He looked exactly as rumour described him, a man who had mistaken restraint for virtue so long it had hardened into habit. A red mark ringed Eleanor's wrist, where Lady Vexley had seized her before the announcement, half hidden by lace. Ashbourne saw it, and his expression altered by a degree so small another observer might have missed it. "Were you informed of this engagement before tonight?" he asked. The question was indecently direct. No one asked her anything directly. She swallowed. "No, my lord." From the drawing-room came renewed laughter, then the scrape of chairs as guests moved toward cards. Ashbourne glanced toward the sound, jaw tightening. "Do you consent to it?" Air seemed to vanish from the conservatory. She heard herself answer with the same mechanical calm she used for household inventories. Consent has not been requested. A long second passed. He said only, I see. He reached into his coat then, not for comfort, but for a folded paper he had not meant to deliver in company. Before he could speak, a footman appeared at the conservatory threshold carrying a salver. My lord, urgent messenger, came from Chambers. Ashbourne took the sealed notice, broke it, and read. Eleanor watched the controlled set of his mouth become harder still. He handed the paper to her. It was from a legal office she recognised from her father's old correspondence. The language was formal, edged with finality. Notice that the Müller Trust, established upon her father's death, would be closed in 10 days unless a disputed ledger, designated Schedule B, pension and charitable allocations, was produced for verification. Absent production, administrative authority would pass in full to the surviving household guardian presently acting under temporary control. Lady Vexley! The page shook in Eleanor's hand, this time beyond denial. 10 days. Whatever remnant her father had preserved for her, income, protection, any legal boundary against being bartered into Mr. Rook's house, could be sealed away by arithmetic and time. Ashbourne spoke as if dictating terms across a desk. I am one of the trustees. This should have been raised sooner. She looked up sharply. You are? Yes. No apology, no softening. Attend my estate office at 9 tomorrow morning. Bring any papers in your possession from your father's accounts, originals and copies. I am not permitted. Miss Müller. His voice did not rise, but it cut cleanly through panic. If the ledger is not found, Lady Vexley's temporary authority becomes permanent. Your personal portion, tenant pensions and designated bequests may be consolidated under her discretion, legally, irreversibly. The words landed one by one, each heavier than the last. From the doorway, Lady Vexley's voice floated sugar-sweet over steel. Eleanor, darling, your fiancé is looking for you. Lord Ashbourne, we are honoured by your concern for domestic trifles. Ashbourne did not look at her. 9 o'clock, he repeated, eyes on Eleanor. Do not be late. Then he inclined his head and stepped past Lady Vexley into the bright perfumed rooms, where people wagered fortunes for sport and called coerced marriages sensible. Eleanor remained by the glass until Lady Vexley's nails dug into her elbow. What did he want? Lady Vexley whispered. Nothing of consequence. Lady Vexley's smile did not move. You will remember who feeds you. Eleanor let herself be steered back toward the drawing-room and Mr. Rook's waiting hand. She smiled when introduced again. She sat where told. She listened to cards slap green bays and counted 10 days in time with her pulse. After midnight, when the house finally dimmed and footsteps thinned, she slipped into the disused morning room where her father's portrait had been exiled. In candlelight, his painted gaze looked less stern than she remembered, as though distance had smudged it. She laid Ashbourne's notice on the escritoire and spread beside it the few papers she had hoarded. Old rent abstracts, 2 receipts signed by the former steward, a torn half-sheet in her father's hand, listing initials and sums that did not balance. At the top he had written in Latin, Fiducia est onus, trust is a burden. Eleanor pressed her fingertips to the page until the shaking eased. If she did nothing, Lady Vexley would hold everything. Her portion, yes, but also the pensions promised to men who had given their backs to her father's land, and the school fund for tenant children that had existed only as figures awaiting release. Lady Vexley called charity waste. Under her management, promises became footnotes and footnotes vanished. If she resisted and failed, she would still be married off. Only now, with the additional stain of public disobedience, men like Mr. Rook preferred frightened wives Society preferred silent ones. She gathered the papers, wrapped them in plain cloth, and tucked them beneath her cloak before dawn. At 6 she corrected the milkman's account. At 7 she endured Lady Vexley's remarks on pallor. At 8 she told the butler she was visiting the modiste and walked out by the service entrance before permission could be denied. London morning bit through wool and gloves. Carriages sprayed mud. Bell towers struck the quarter hour with indifferent clarity. She arrived on Ashbourne Street with damp hems and a heart thudding far too visibly, and paused only once before the black-painted door of his estate office. Inside that door were ledgers, trustees, and men who could declare her either liar or legal fact. Inside that door, perhaps, were the missing numbers her father had hidden to protect more than her. Eleanor lifted her hand and knocked, steady this time because there was no room left for Trembling. The door opened almost at once, as if someone had been waiting just behind it. A thin, ink-stained clerk looked Eleanor over from bonnet ribbon to mud-flecked hem, took in the plain-wrapped packet under her arm, and stepped aside without comment. "Miss Smaller, his lordship is expecting you. This way!" The estate office was not part of Ashbourne House's glittering front. It sat behind it in a square of sober rooms, lined with deed boxes, locked cabinets, and long tables scarred by decades of ledgers dragged across wood. No mirrors, no flowers, no effort spent on comfort where accuracy would do. Ashbourne stood at the central table in shirt-sleeves, coat discarded, cuffs fastened with plain black links. 2 clerks sorted bundles at his elbow. He did not waste surprise on seeing her punctual. "You are on time," he said. "Good, sit." Eleanor removed her gloves. Her fingers were steady now, though cold. She set down her packet and untied the cord. "These are what I have. Rent abstracts, steward receipts, and my father's memorandum fragments." Ashbourne motioned to the nearer clerk. "Mr. Dane, index these against the trust schedules. Priority to anything marked pension, school, or relief." To Eleanor, "You will review with him and identify your father's hand where uncertain. We have 10 days. In practice, fewer. If Lady Vexley petitions for administrative confirmation before production, delay favours her. No, please, no assurance it would be well. Only moving parts and deadlines." It was, Eleanor discovered, oddly easier to breathe in such air. By 9:30, the table was covered in columns and cross-references. Mr. Dane brought out the trust abstract. Schedule A, property revenues. Schedule C, annuities. Schedule D, educational reserves. Between A and C, like a pulled tooth, the absence of Schedule B. "Pension and charitable allocations?" Eleanor said quietly. "Correct," Ashbourne replied. "And the schedule with the broadest discretionary language, if unverified. Your father drafted safeguards, but safeguards are only as strong as the paper proving them." He slid another sheet toward her. It listed disbursements from the 2 years since her father's death. Several entries appeared regular, until one noticed they were rounded too neatly, as if a hand had shaved away inconvenient pennies that might have told a truer story. Eleanor bent closer. "These are not his balancing habits." "You are certain?" "My father never rounded tenant pensions to whole pounds. Never! He said poverty lived in shillings." Something unreadable moved across Ashbourne's face and vanished. "Then we treat these as suspect." He gave orders with crisp economy. 1 clerk to Lincoln's Inn archives for probate transfer lists, 1 to the bank for draft registers, 1 to retrieve inventory from the Muller townhouse at the date of death. Eleanor expected to be dismissed while men did men's work. Instead, Ashbourne handed her a key. "Correspondence room, second door left. You will search your father's outgoing letters from his final 6 months. Anything mentioning duplicate books, schedule marks, or cipher references comes to me directly. She stared at the key in her palm. I'm allowed in there. A fractional lift of his brow. By my authority. It should not have mattered, that simple metal weight, yet as she crossed the threshold into the correspondence room, with its ranks of tied letters, indexed drawers, and dust that smelled of paper rather than perfume, she felt, for the first time in 2 years, like a person whose mind was expected to produce more than compliance. She worked until noon without lifting her head. Dates first, hands second, then anomalies. Her father had used a private notation when he doubted an account. A small slanted stroke beneath certain numerals, almost invisible unless one knew to look. She found it in copies of 2 letters to the former estate steward, Lady Vexley's brother, Mr. Godwin Pike, requesting clarification on temporary transfers from pension reserve to household repairs. The sums matched the rounded disbursements on Ashbourne's suspect sheet. By 1 o'clock she had 3 references and an ache at the base of her neck. When she returned to the main table, Mr. Dane was there with fresh trouble. Message from Hollis and Brand, my lord. The Chancery copyist assigned to the Muller schedules has gone ill. Search delay of 2 days. Ashbourne held out his hand for the note, read and said flatly, Nonsense! Brand does not delay filings for influenza. He turned to Eleanor. Who at Hollis and Brand handled your father's trust personally? Mr. Latham, senior clerk. Dane, send for Latham now, in writing. Mark it urgent by trustee authority. Dane went. Eleanor heard herself ask, Can they truly delay us because a clerk is ill? They can delay for any reason at all if paid enough to misplace urgency. He said it like weather. At 2, rain began. At 3, Mr. Latham arrived damp and anxious, hat in hands, and after 10 strained minutes with Ashbourne behind a closed door, emerged with the complexion of milk. No illness, Ashbourne said when he returned. Your stepmother's man paid one of Brand's junior copyists to put the Miller file at the bottom of the stack and forget it there. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Mr. Pike. Likely. We have the copyist's name and a witness to the payment. Not signed. Not yet useful. Not yet useful. Every fact a piece, waiting for its legal shape. At 4, a folded note arrived from Lady Vexley's house, brought by one of their own footmen, who looked at Eleanor as if she had broken something expensive. Lady Vexley's hand was elegant and venomous. Miss Muller, your absence from home without leave has not gone unnoticed. Return at once. Mr. Rooke has called twice and expresses concern at your agitation. Society is already unkind to girls who mistake trustees for admirers. Do not force me to protect this family from further embarrassment. Eleanor passed the note to Ashbourne without comment. He read it, set it aside, and rang for a messenger. Reply to Lady Vexley. Miss Muller is engaged in trustee business under my direct instruction. Any interference will be entered in the record. He paused, then added, Copy to her solicitor. When he looked up, Eleanor was watching him, surprised. What? Nothing, my lord. Say it. She folded her hands to stop herself twisting them. I did not expect to be defended in writing. His expression did not soften, but his voice lowered by a shade. This is not defence. It is procedure. Yet he sent the letter all the same. On the 3rd day, London began whispering. A viscountess with too many pearls told a breakfast table that Miss Muller had developed legal ambitions and a taste for private interviews with earls. A columnist in the Morning Register remarked with coy cruelty on young ladies who discover fiduciary detail only after being overlooked by romance. By evening the story had improved itself. She had entrapped Ashbourne. She forged figures. She feigned distress in conservatories. Lady Vexley fought as she did everything. Socially first, legally second, and always with a smile. Mr. Rook arrived at Ashbourne's office near closing, announced by a servant who looked offended on behalf of propriety. He entered smelling of clove and self-regard, removed his gloves finger by finger, and bowed to Eleanor as one might acknowledge property that had strayed into an untidy lane. "My dear Miss Miller, you have caused concern. Lady Vexley feared nerves. I said, no, youth often mistakes excitement for judgment." Ashbourne did not offer him a chair. "State your business, Mr. Rook." Rook produced a folded parchment from his inner pocket and laid it on the desk with care. "Only to regularise what has already been honourably settled. Marriage licence dated and prepared. Lady Vexley's consent documented as guardian. We need only Miss Muller's signature and your lordship's blessing as trustee to still vulgar chatter." Eleanor felt the room sharpen. "I will not sign," she said. Rook gave a patient little laugh. "Come, child, financial uncertainty unnerves females. A husband provides structure." "I said no." He turned to Ashbourne. "You see, hysteria." Ashbourne's eyes were glacial. "What I see is attempted execution of a contract while the beneficiary's trust status is under dispute. Ill-timed, Mr. Rook." "Entirely timed," Rook replied, letting the courtesy drop. "The girl is unprovided for if this phantom ledger remains missing. Her stepmother cannot keep her indefinitely. I offer a respectable solution." Eleanor spoke before Ashbourne could. "You offer acquisition at discount." Rook's head snapped toward her, colour rising. "Mind your tongue." Ashbourne stepped between them with such quiet finality that Rook took one involuntary step back. "Leave," Ashbourne said. "Now!" Rook gathered his parchment with shaking fingers. He tried to hide. At the door he turned once more to Eleanor, voice thick with warning. "Defiance does not improve a woman's prospects, Miss Muller." When he had gone, silence held for a long moment. Eleanor realised she was gripping the table edge hard enough to hurt. She released it. "Thank you." Ashbourne's gaze rested briefly on her hand, then moved away. "Do not thank me. Keep refusing." Complications multiplied with the hours. A storage inventory from the Muller townhouse arrived incomplete. 2 crates listed at probate were untraceable. Mr. Pike could not be found at his last address. The bribed copyist denied everything when approached. Deadline, 6 days. Then, just as dusk settled, shouting rose from the mews behind the office, sharp, panicked, the unmistakable pitch of a child in pain. Eleanor was moving before anyone told her to. She ran through the back passage into rain-wet cobbles, where a small crowd had formed around an overturned cart. A boy of perhaps 12 lay half-curled against the wheel, sleeve torn, face white as paste, biting his lip to keep from crying out. One arm bent wrong, midway between wrist and elbow. "Don't move him," Eleanor said, kneeling in mud. A stable hand stammered. "Wheel slipped. He fell. Fetch 2 splints, straight boards, and linen, now." She slid a hand beneath the boy's shoulder. "What is your name?" "Tom." "Tom, look at me. You are going to be all right. I need you still." His eyes were huge, wet with shock. "It hurts." "I know." She took off her own shawl, folded it thickly under his arm. "You may shout, only don't jerk." By the time the boards came, she had improvised a sling and directed a groom to send for the nearest surgeon at once. Not the cheapest. Ashbourne stood a few paces away in the rain, coat darkening, saying nothing, watching her work with quick, competent hands that never once checked whether her skirt hem was ruined or who might be looking. When the surgeon's carriage finally clattered in, Eleanor gave a concise report. Mechanism, visible deformity, pulse, time since injury. The man blinked, startled by the precision, then nodded and took over. Only then did she stand and sway, suddenly light-headed. Ashbourne steadied her elbow. "You're soaked through," he said. "So is he. Tom will be treated." "And his mother told before rumour does," Eleanor replied. "He said she takes in washing off Brook Street." Ashbourne signalled a footman immediately. "Find her! Bring her to St. Jude's surgery." As the footman ran, he looked back at Eleanor. Rain had loosened strands of dark hair at her temples. There was mud on her glove and a streak of blood on her cuff. "You did not hesitate," he said. She met his gaze. "Pain rarely waits for permission, my lord." Something in his expression shifted. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a language he had forgotten, he knew. That night, exhausted and chilled, Eleanor sat in the correspondence room with blankets around her shoulders and refused to go home until she finished one more drawer. Ashbourne sent tea she did not drink. At some point he came to the doorway. "Enough for today." "Not yet. Your clerk indexed one transfer file under Müller, Educational Endowments. It should be under pensions unless someone wanted it overlooked." He remained where he was, hand on the frame. "Miss Müller, you can barely hold the pen." "I can still read." "A beat." Then, "Very well, 15 minutes." She found it in 12, a packet of stewardship reports from Mr. Pike, copied in his broad hand, attached to bank drafts initialled J.R., Jonah Rook. The dates aligned with the month's pension disbursements shrank. Next to one sum, in a hand not Pike's, someone had scribbled household exigencies per L.V. The ink was newer than the page. Eleanor carried the packet straight to Ashbourne's desk. He scanned it once, jaw tightening. "This ties Rook to Pike financially. Not enough for fraud, but enough for motive and collusion. And Lady Vexley's instruction. Circumstantial, still useful." Useful. Again that word. She almost laughed from fatigue. "Where is the ledger?" she whispered. "If my father knew they would do this, why leave us hunting ghosts?" Ashbourne's eyes flicked to the towering shelves of transferred estate books along the wall. Volumes from probate, many never reopened because their contents were deemed duplicated elsewhere. "Your father was cautious," he said. "Men who trust paper hide originals in plain sight." Her gaze followed his to the shelves. Law digests, rent rolls, classical texts from the townhouse library, spines faded but intact. Her father's old habit flashed in memory, tucking letters into whatever book was nearest, arguing that thieves searched boxes, not poetry. She crossed to the shelf almost without deciding to, ran her fingers along cracked leather titles. Horace, Livy, a Virgil, heavy quarto, the exact edition he had used to torment her with declensions when she was 10. She pulled it free. Dust rose. Inside, halfway through the Aeneid, the pages had been cut and hollowed with painstaking care. A slim ledger lay hidden in the cavity, wrapped in oilskin gone brittle at the folds. For a second she could not breathe. "Ashbourne!" He was beside her in 3 strides. She set the book on the table and unwrapped the packet with reverent shaking hands. On the first page, Schedule B, pensions, charitable allocations, school reserve. Her father's unmistakable hand, blunt and deliberate. Beneath it, tucked like an afterthought, a folded note addressed in the same hand, "To Lord Ashbourne, private." Eleanor looked up, sharply. "To you?" He held out his hand. She did not give it. "Read it aloud," she said. A long pause stretched between them, taut as wire. Then Ashbourne inclined his head once, accepting the demand. She passed him the note. He unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled in the quiet room. "My lord," he read, voice even at first, If this reaches you, my health has failed me sooner than expected. I place Schedule B where men of appetite are least likely to look and ask, explicitly ask, that you see my daughter Eleanor protected from any marriage contracted under debt pressure or guardian coercion, while trust matters stand unresolved. She has more sense than those who dismiss her, and less cruelty than this city rewards. I rely on your honour where law may lag. The rest was inventory instruction and 2 lines about witness signatures. Ashbourne lowered the note. Eleanor stood very still. "You received this?" she said. "Yes." "And did nothing?" His mouth tightened. "I secured the transfer of books. I maintained trustee status." "You watched." "I withdrew from—" He stopped. Began again. "After my brother died, I withdrew from most private obligations. I delegated what should not have been delegated. By the time irregularities surfaced, your stepmother had legal cover, and you had—" "An engagement announced like livestock sale," Eleanor said, voice thin with contained fury. "And that was when action became convenient." Ashbourne did not flinch. "Necessary." "Necessary for law, perhaps, not for me." Silence rang. In the corridor a clock struck 11. Eleanor took the note back from his hand and refolded it with precise care, as if handling something that could still bruise her if touched wrongly. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, not softer, sharper. "Very well, we proceed on necessity." She opened the recovered ledger and began turning pages fast, eyes scanning columns, marks, signatures. Her father's cipher appeared in the margins, numeric substitutions keyed to Latin verse numbers, exactly as he had taught her to puzzle out for amusement. Not amusement now. Mr. Pike altered the public abstracts, but he missed the cipher totals here. "See," she tapped one line, "the pension pool should have remained at 1,216 after Michaelmas. Public account shows 900. Difference routed through repair contingencies." Ashbourne leaned in. "Can you decode the full sequence tonight?" "Yes." "You should sleep." "You should have acted sooner." She did not look up. "Neither of us is getting what we should." He stood a moment longer, then nodded once. "What do you require?" At last she met his eyes. "2 copyists I choose myself. Sealing wax, certified duplicates by morning. Summons drafts for Hollis and Brand's junior copyist, Mr. Latham, the surgeon from St. Jude's, and any pensioner whose payment was cut. Also a runner to Brook Street. Tom's mother may know which households received temporary levy notices." Ashbourne listened without interruption. "An access," she finished, "to every room where Müller papers are kept. No chaperone. No delays. You shall have it." She held his gaze a heartbeat longer, then returned to the ledger. "Good. Then stand behind me if asked, but do not stand in front of me again." For the first time since she had known him, Ashbourne bowed. Not socially, not out of habit, but in acknowledgement. "As you wish, Miss Müller." Past midnight, the office lamps burned on. Eleanor sat at the long table with the recovered ledger open, her father's note beside her, like a blade and a blessing both. She no longer waited for rescue, nor for permission dressed as mercy. She wrote headings, listed witnesses, marked contradictions, and built her case line by line as if drafting the architecture of her own name. Her hands trembled only when she paused long enough to feel them. Then she set her jaw, dipped the pen again, and kept going. At 1:15, the first copyist arrived. At 1:30, the second. Eleanor rejected the first man Ashbourne's steward proposed, a cousin of someone in Lady Vexley's household, surely harmless, and chose instead 2 grey-faced scriveners from Chancery Lane who looked too tired to lie for anyone cheaply. They worked in shifts at the long table, while wax dripped and hardened in red pools. Eleanor dictated cipher marks and line breaks. Mr. Dane checked numerals aloud. Ashbourne stood at the mantel, reading each finished folio before sealing it with his signet and writing a chain of custody note in his own hand. By 3, the office smelled of hot wax, wet wool, and ink. By 4, the first blow landed. A pounding rattled the front door hard enough to wake half the square. Mr. Dane hurried out and came back with 2 constables, a magistrate's runner, and a folded order edged with official blue ribbon. The runner cleared his throat and read with practised boredom. On petition of Lady Agatha Vexley, acting guardian of Miss Eleanor Müller, alleging unlawful retention of ward and removal of family papers from guardian premises, this office is directed to secure all Müller Trust materials pending inquiry into potential document theft and fabrication. Fabrication. The word seemed to thud against the walls. Eleanor set down her pen carefully. She moved quickly. "Because she was watching us," Ashbourne said. The runner continued. "Materials to be surrendered into neutral custody before noon today at Lincoln's Inn Records Chamber. Failure to comply may be construed as obstruction of fiduciary inquiry." One constable shifted, embarrassed to be in a nobleman's office with mud on his boots. "No offence meant, my lord. We're to witness transfer, is all." Ashbourne read the order, expression unreadable. "You have witnessed the materials in question?" "No, my lord." "You will." He passed the order to Mr. Dane. "Bring the dispatch box." The next hour was all procedure and threat braided together. Every paper touched was listed. Every seal was described aloud. Eleanor watched as the recovered original ledger, her father's blunt script, her one unarguable proof, was wrapped again in oilskin and laid inside a locked steel-bound box with 2 wax seals, Ashbourne's crest and the constable's station mark. When the lid closed, she had to unclench her jaw deliberately. "If that box is tampered with," she said to the runner, "I will require the names of every hand that touched it." The runner blinked at her, surprised by the iron in her voice. "Yes, miss." Before they departed, a second note arrived, this one from Lady Vexley's solicitor, thick paper and thicker malice. "Be advised that any further public appearance by Miss Müller in masculine legal spaces will be entered as evidence of instability and undue influence. My client remains prepared to receive her home and proceed with her honourable engagement to Mr. Rooke, whose patience is not inexhaustible." Eleanor handed it to Ashbourne. He read, folded it once, and tucked it into the evidence packet. "Good," he said coldly. "Another exhibit." As dawn thinned the rain, the dispatch carriage rolled away under constable escort. Eleanor stood at the office window until it vanished into mist and soot. "What if they lose it?" she asked. "They must not." "That is not an answer." Ashbourne looked at her then, directly. "If they lose it, they lose pensions, school reserves, and your legal autonomy in one stroke. Lady Vexley regains discretionary control. Mr. Rooke presses the marriage while you are discredited. That is precisely why she forced neutral custody before we could finish certifying every copy." The stakes were no longer figures in ledgers. They were bodies and futures, old men whose coal money had already been shaved, children who would never see a schoolroom. Eleanor's own life folded into a contract she had never agreed to. Mr. Dane came in pale. "Message from Brook Street. Tom's mother says a man visited in the night asking whether she'd spoken to Miss Müller. Offered money to remember nothing." Eleanor closed her eyes for one hard second. Did she take it? No. She told him to get off her stoop. "Get her written statement now," Eleanor said, "and keep someone with her." Outside, church bells began striking 5. Inside, every gain they had made in one night felt suddenly as fragile as drying ink. At 9, Mr. Latham sent word that Hollis and Brand's junior copyist, the one paid to delay the files, would meet discreetly if promised immunity from public naming. He would sign a confession before noon at a coffee house off Fleet Street. Ashbourne wanted a barrister present. The barrister was delayed in Westminster. Time was not. "I can take his statement with Dane as witness," Eleanor said. Ashbourne's mouth tightened. "You should not go alone." "I will not go alone. Dane, 2 men and no liveries. If he vanishes, we lose him." Ashbourne held her gaze, weighing risk against dwindling hours. Then he nodded once. "1 hour. If you're not back by 11, I come myself." Fleet Street was a churn of carts, printers' boys and dripping hats. The coffee house smelled of burnt sugar and wet coats. Eleanor and Mr. Dane took a back table where they could see the door. The copyist arrived 10 minutes late, eyes darting, collar askew. Barely 20, with ink ground into his nails. "Miss Müller?" he whispered. "Yes, sit. Name?" "Edwin Marsh." Dane set paper and ink between them. "State, in your own words, what payment you received and from whom." Marsh swallowed. "I was given 3 guineas by a gentleman called Pike, Godwin Pike, to place the Müller schedules at the bottom of the search stack and tell any inquirer the assigned copyist was ill." "Date," he gave it. Handshaking, he began to write. Then the coffee-house door opened again. Mr. Rooke entered, not looking at Eleanor, as if by chance, as if Fleet Street had pulled him in by whim. He removed his gloves slowly, scanned the room once, and let his gaze rest, briefly, deliberately, on Edwin Marsh. Marsh's pen stopped. Ink pooled. Rooke smiled without warmth and chose a table near the window. Marsh went paper white. "I can't." "You can," Eleanor said quietly. "You already have. He'll ruin me. You accepted a bribe to ruin others." Marsh shoved back his chair so fast it screeched. "I can't!" He snatched the half-written statement and bolted. "Marsh!" Dane lunged, missed his sleeve by inches. Eleanor was already up, skirts in hand, pushing through startled patrons. She reached the door in time to see Marsh dart into the street between 2 wagons, clutching the paper. A hackney wheel slid on wet stones. Horses screamed. Someone shouted. Marsh went down hard beneath the shaft, body folding unnaturally. The paper flew from his hand into the gutter where carriage mud and rain turned ink to black milk in seconds. For one suspended moment, all sound narrowed to the ringing in Eleanor's ears. Then chaos resumed. Men hauling at harness, a woman screaming for a surgeon. Rooke on the coffee-house step, face composed, as if witnessing weather. Eleanor dropped beside Marsh, hands already at his neck, searching pulse. Faint, thready, blood at the temple. "Dane, get a surgeon!" "Now!" Dane ran. Marsh's eyes fluttered open once. "Don't tell!" he gasped, and then pain took his breath in a broken cry. By the time they moved him to St. Bride's infirmary, he was insensible. "Skull fracture," the surgeon said. Maybe he would wake, maybe not. No signed confession, no usable statement. Their witness had become a body on a cot. When Eleanor returned to Ashbourne's office near noon, mud to her knees and blood drying at her cuff again, she found another disaster waiting. The constable escort carriage had been stopped en route to Lincoln's Inn by a broken axle near Temple Bar. In the confusion, crowd shouting, 2 rival drays jammed in the lane, the dispatch box vanished. Vanished. Ashbourne stood behind his desk, holding the constable's report as if force alone could alter its lines. "They searched drains, carts, tavern yards," Mr. Dane said hoarsely. "Nothing!" Eleanor stared at him. "The box was chained." "Chain cut! How long?" "Minutes." Too swift for chance. Planned. She felt something inside her tilt, not dramatically, just enough to make the room's edges go distant. They had found the ledger, copied through the night, and now the original had been swallowed by London between one street and the next. Ashbourne spoke, each word clipped. "What remains?" Eleanor forced herself to answer like a clerk taking inventory after a fire. "2 full duplicates in cipher, 1 certified to folio 48 before interruption, 1 uncertified but complete in my hand and Dane's cross-check marks, father's note copied verbatim, Pike transfer packet, LV solicitor threats, Tom's mother verbal, not yet sworn, Marsh unavailable." "Unavailable!" Dane echoed bitterly. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair without meaning to. For the first time since the conservatory, her hands shook visibly, uncontrollably. "I told you not to send it," she whispered, though she had not said any such thing. "I should have gone with it. I should have—" Ashbourne came around the desk, crouched to her level, and set one gloved hand flat on the table between them, not touching her, anchoring the space. "Look at me." She did. "We have lost the original. We have not lost the truth. Do you understand the distinction?" Tears burned, furious and unwanted. Truth without proof is a story told by a woman no one intends to believe. His voice roughened, almost imperceptibly. "Then we build proof from what cannot be stolen in one box." Outside, wheels clattered, and life went on, indifferent. Inside, uncertainty finally became real enough to taste. That evening, after Eleanor had been persuaded, ordered, to sleep for 2 hours on the office settee, Ashbourne stood alone in his private study, door shut against clerks and crisis alike. Rain tapped the window glass. The fire had burned low. On his desk lay 3 things: the copy of Edmund Miller's note asking for Eleanor's protection, the constable report of the stolen dispatch box, and an older letter in his late brother Christopher's hand, edges softened by too much handling. He had not opened Christopher's letter in months. He opened it now. "You cannot audit grief into obedience, Will," Christopher had written years ago after their mother's funeral, teasing and rebuking in equal measure. "One day someone will need more of you than efficiency, and you will discover too late that detachment is only fear in better tailoring." Ashbourne let the paper fall. He had been 27 when Christopher died, a winter fever that turned to pneumonia in 4 days, quick and senseless. Ashbourne had sat beside that bed and counted spoonfuls of laudanum like numbers could keep death to schedule. Afterward, he learned to survive by subtraction. Fewer dinners, fewer attachments, fewer requests he might fail to answer. He became excellent at responsibility that required signatures and terrible at responsibility that required presence. And because he had made an altar of composure, a young woman had stood in a conservatory with a bruise on her wrist while he asked procedural questions. He pressed fingers to his eyes once, hard, a knock. His solicitor, Mr. Hale, entered on Ashbourne's curt permission and stopped when he saw the expression he had perhaps never seen on his employer's face. "The drafts are ready," Hale said carefully. "Emergency petition regarding the theft, motion to compel Pike's appearance, and notice contesting guardian coercion." Ashbourne nodded without looking up. Hale hesitated. "There is another matter. Lady Vexley's counsel intends to argue that your involvement with Miss Muller is personal impropriety, not fiduciary duty. They will try to disqualify your testimony as biased." A humourless laugh escaped him. At last, an accusation with some merit. Hale blinked. "My lord," Ashbourne looked at him then, all pretence stripped clean. "I failed that girl before I ever met her. Her father asked for protection. I filed his request and called it done. If they name me biased now, it is because I am no longer willing to stand at a safe distance while others do violence politely." Hale said nothing. He had served this house for 15 years and knew when silence was respect. After a long moment, Ashbourne added, quieter, "Prepare for them to attack my character. Let them. They are not to touch hers unanswered." When Hale left, Ashbourne remained where he was, hands braced on the desk, breathing like a man who had run uphill in the dark and found at the top that he was still afraid. Not of scandal, not of losing face, of caring in public and failing any way. He took up Christopher's letter, folded it once and put it in his inside pocket before returning to the war rooms and lamplight. Near midnight, with sworn statements finally stacking into something like a case, the final move came. A carriage drew up hard at the office door, not Ashbourne's, not hired. Lady Vexley's crest glinted on the panel. Mr. Dane swore under his breath and went to intercept, but Lady Vexley did not deign to enter. She sent in her solicitor, and behind him, Mr. Godwin Pike, newly shaved, elegantly dressed, and very much not missing. Pike smiled at Eleanor as though they had met at a musicale. "Miss Muller, how industrious!" The solicitor bowed to Ashbourne. "My lord, service of notice." He handed over 3 documents in quick succession. First, formal accusation that Eleanor had stolen and forged trust materials with Ashbourne's undue intimate encouragement. Second, petition to enforce guardian authority immediately and compel Eleanor's return to Lady Vexley's house pending inquiry. Third, notification that trustees would hear the matter at Lincoln's Inn tomorrow at noon, publicly, because Lady Vexley had demanded open scrutiny to clear her name. Pike laid one more paper on the table, almost lovingly, an affidavit in his own hand declaring that Edmund Muller had destroyed Schedule B before death, and that any ledger now produced must be counterfeit. "I should hate for everyone to be embarrassed by youthful invention," he said. Eleanor felt the room narrow around his voice. Ashbourne read the notices with frightening calm. "Is that all?" "Not quite." The solicitor turned to Eleanor. "Mr. Rooke has also lodged intention to enforce an engagement contract entered under your guardian's authority. He will appear tomorrow to protect his lawful interests." "Of course he would. In public, with witnesses." As they withdrew, Pike paused at the threshold and looked back. "Oh, and if you mean to rely on that constable's dispatch loss, be advised we have 2 gentlemen prepared to testify the box never contained an original ledger at all. Merely a blank account paper." The door closed behind him. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Mr. Dane exploded. "Blank paper! I watched that ledger sealed." "And they will say we swapped it," Eleanor said flatly. She took one of the notices, read it again as if repetition might alter text. It did not. "If they force me back under guardianship before noon, I cannot even appear freely." Ashbourne was already writing. "Hale will file an immediate stay at first light. Dane, wake him now. Send riders for Tom's mother and Mr. Latham. They testify to interference and delay. Fetch Street. Jude's surgeon's signed account of pension arrears tied to treatment refusals. And find Marsh's surgeon. If Marsh wakes by morning, we take deposition from his bed." "He may not wake," Dane said. "Then we proceed without him." Eleanor stood very straight, notices in hand, face pale as paper and harder than steel. "They want spectacle," she said. "They shall have it." Ashbourne looked at her. "Tomorrow they will call you liar, thief, hysteric, seductress, likely in one breath. Are you prepared?" Her answer came without tremor. "No, but I will do it anyway." Outside, bells marked 1 o'clock, 11 hours to noon. On the table between them lay duplicate ledgers, half-certified statements, and the ruins of certainty. Beyond the windows, London slept badly, eager for scandal by breakfast. Eleanor dipped her pen, wrote her name at the top of a fresh affidavit page, and did not stop. Eleanor wrote until the sky went from black to pewter and the candles guttered in their own wax. At 6, mister. Hale arrived with ink on his cuffs and bad temper on his tongue. At 7, a judge in chambers granted a temporary stay against forced return to Lady Vexley's guardianship, pending the noon hearing. At 8, Mr. Dane came back from St. Bride's Infirmary with blood on his sleeve and triumph in his face. "Marsh woke," he said, breathless. "Only for minutes. Surgeon witnessed. He signed." He held up the page as if it were a relic. The signature was a shaky ruin of letters, but legible. Edwin Marsh. Beneath it, in halting lines, payment from Godwin Pike to delay Muller schedules at Hollis and Brand, and instruction that any inquiry be turned aside with false illness. No mention of Rook. Perhaps fear still closed that door. It would have to be enough. Eleanor read it once, then placed it atop her stack of exhibits. Her hands were so stiff she could barely flex her fingers. Ashbourne watched her pin the pages together. "You have not eaten? Neither have you. That is not an answer. It is today." By 11:30, Lincoln's Inn Hall was crowded beyond comfort. Barristers in wigs murmured in knots. Clerks carried bundles. Curious society faces had found their way to the back benches under pretence of business. Lady Vexley sat at the front in widow's black veil, lifted just enough to display righteous injury. Beside her, Mr. Rook, broad and satisfied, and Mr. Pike with a mouth made for plausible lies. Eleanor took her seat at the opposing table with Mr. Hale and Mr. Dane. Ashbourne stood behind her chair, not touching it. When the trustees entered and order was called, the sound in the room thinned to paper rustle and breath. Lady Vexley's counsel began with elegance sharpened to a blade. Miss Muller was unstable, influenced, improperly lodged in an unmarried gentleman's offices. A missing original ledger had conveniently reappeared only when marriage negotiations displeased her. Forgery, theft, and feminine excitability were suggested in one uninterrupted arc. Furthermore, counsel said, turning half toward the trustees and half toward the audience, this unfortunate girl has been encouraged into public performance by Lord Ashbourne, whose interest appears less fiduciary than personal. A murmur swept the benches. Eleanor kept her eyes on the table until the murmur died. Then she rose. "My lords," she said, voice clear enough to carry, "I request leave to speak for myself and present evidence directly." One trustee, elderly and severe, peered down his spectacles. "You are represented by counsel, Miss Muller." "Yes, sir, and I am also the beneficiary you are being asked to declare incompetent." A pause. Then the chairman nodded once. "Proceed, briefly." Eleanor drew one breath and stepped into the centre space. "Lady Vexley's petition rests on 3 claims," she said. "That Schedule B never existed, that documents now produced are forged, and that my refusal to marry Mr. Rook is caprice rather than coercion. I will answer each in order." She lifted the first bound packet. "This is a duplicate of Schedule B in my father's hand and cipher. The original was sealed under constable witness and stolen in transit yesterday. Chain cut, box removed. Theft does not void content when certified duplicates and correlated accounts survive." Lady Vexley's counsel rose. "Objection. She asserts certification not in evidence." Eleanor held up a second packet. "Certification to folio 48 by 2 independent Chancery scriveners sworn this morning. Complete duplicate in my hand with Mr. Dane's numerical cross-checks. I ask leave to submit both." Leave was granted. Papers passed forward. She continued each sentence steadier than the last. "My father's cipher key used line references to Virgil. I learned it from him at 13. I can decode any challenged entry now." Mr. Pike gave a small laugh. "A charming parlour trick." Eleanor turned toward him. Then let us play, Mr. Pike. Choose a line. He blinked, caught off guard. What? Any line mark from folio 12. Read the public abstract amount, then read the cipher total. Let the trustees hear who changed which number. Pike's colour shifted. He looked to counsel. Counsel looked away. The chairman rapped his gavel lightly. Mr. Pike, answer. Pike took the page with visible reluctance. Public amount, £200. Eleanor spoke without looking down. Cipher total, £312, 8 shillings. Difference routed to household contingencies by your stewardship note dated Michaelmas. Exhibit C. Mr. Hale slid Exhibit C to the bench. Pike's own report with the transfer notation. Eleanor moved before interruption could gather. Second claim, forgery. I submit sworn statement of Edwin Marsh, junior copyist at Hollis and Brand, signed at St. Bride's Infirmary this morning under surgeon witness, attesting he accepted payment from Mr. Pike to delay trust schedules and report false illness. This time the murmur became a hiss. Counsel lunged to his feet. A dying declaration produced at the 11th hour. Not dying, Eleanor said sharply. Concussed! Alive when sworn! She turned a page, found the line and read, 3 guineas paid by Mr. Godwin Pike to bury Muller-file and say, copyist indisposed. His words. His signature. Pike half rose. The boy lies. Then sue him when he can stand, Eleanor replied. A few people in the gallery laughed before being silenced. Third claim, she said, and now her voice cooled to iron, that my engagement to Mr. Rooke was honourable and freely made. Mr. Rooke stood as if summoned by vanity itself. It was announced with guardian consent before witnesses of quality. Announced, yes, Eleanor said. To me as one announces purchase. I was not consulted. Rooke spread his hands. Girls are often shy at first. Girls, perhaps. Women are not livestock. His face darkened. Mind yourself. I'm doing so for the first time. She faced the trustees again. Under trust law, a guardian may not contract a beneficiary's marriage where financial dependence and disputed control create duress. Mr. Rooke presented a predated license while my trust status was under challenge. He pressed signature in Lord Ashbourne's office. Witnesses present. Mr. Dane stood at once. I was present. So was I, Ashbourne said from behind her, voice quiet and carrying farther than a shout. For the first time all day, heads turned to him. Counsel seized his chance. My Lord Ashbourne, do you deny personal attachment that compromises objectivity? Ashbourne did not move. I confirm facts. The licence existed, was presented, and was refused by Miss Muller. I confirm also that pension disbursements were reduced while household contingencies rose under Mr. Pike's management. And I confirm I delayed action longer than I should have. My failure does not erase her evidence. The admission landed like a stone in water, noisy, then very still. Lady Vexley rose abruptly, veil trembling with her fury. This is theatrical slander. That girl has always been unstable, grateful one moment, wild the next. I fed and clothed her while she schemed with clerks and earls. Eleanor met her stepmother's gaze across the hall. You fed me because my father paid for this house. You clothed me in old gowns and called it charity. You diverted pension funds and called it prudence. You arranged my sale and called it rescue. Lady Vexley took a step forward as if to strike her with words, or worse. You ungrateful little... Mr. Rooke moved first, perhaps believing spectacle would cow her. He strode into the open floor, seized Eleanor's wrist, and raised his voice for the room. As her intended husband, I claim my right to remove her from this disgrace. She is overwrought. Gasps, chairs scraping. Eleanor did not pull away. She looked down at his hand on her skin, then up at the trustees. "Let the record show," she said, each word cut clean, "that Mr. Jonah Rook places hands on me without consent in open hearing and invokes an engagement I here and now renounce as coerced under financial duress. I refuse him. Publicly, finally." She twisted her wrist once, hard, exactly where his thumb met bone. He cursed and released her. The chairman struck the gavel. "Mr. Rook, stand back immediately," Rook blustered. "She cannot simply renounce—" "She has," said the chairman, "and you will be silent." The hall seemed to exhale all at once. Eleanor stepped back to her table, pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and set both palms flat on the wood until the room steadied. No one had rescued her. She had done it herself. The trustees withdrew for deliberation. It should have ended there, but Lady Vexley was not a woman who surrendered to procedure. In the antechamber corridor she cornered Mr. Latham, the senior clerk from Hollis and Brand, before he was called, voice low and lethal. Eleanor, coming round the pillar with Dane, heard every word. "You will remember," Lady Vexley said, "that your son's apprenticeship papers passed through my cousin's office. A pity if delays occurred." Latham's face crumpled. "My lady, please." Eleanor stepped forward. "Threatening witnesses now." "In Lincoln's Inn," Lady Vexley spun. "Do not preach to me, girl. Men run this world on pressure and favour. I merely learned their methods better than you." "Better than me?" Eleanor held out her hand to Latham. "Give me your statement." Latham hesitated, eyes darting to Lady Vexley, then placed the folded sheet in Eleanor's palm, as if handing over a lit match. She opened it, signed, dated, confirming Pike's payment to Marsh and subsequent attempts to suppress file searches, at the urging of parties representing Lady Vexley's household. Lady Vexley lunged, snatching for the paper. Eleanor moved first, stepping back and lifting it high. "Mr. Dane," she said, not taking her eyes off Lady Vexley, "read this aloud." Dane took it and obeyed, voice ringing in the corridor while barristers and clerks slowed to listen. By the second paragraph a small crowd had formed. By the signature line whispers were already racing ahead. "Lies," Lady Vexley hissed. "All of you lies." "Then swear so under oath," Eleanor said. Lady Vexley drew herself up, composure cracking at the edges. "You think you've won because you can add columns and mimic men. You are still nothing without a name." Eleanor's answer was almost gentle. "I have my father's. Mine will do." When the trustees returned, they called for one final witness, the surgeon from St. Jude's, summoned on Eleanor's insistence. He was a practical man with blunt hands and no appetite for society drama. Asked what relevance he had to trust accounts, he said, "Relevance? Pensioners came to me unable to pay for splints, medicine, coal. I treated 3 on credit this winter because funds they expected had not arrived. Miss Muller settled 1 bill herself from pin money. If your ledgers say benevolence, then your ledgers have not met my waiting room." That stripped the last varnish. Mr. Pike attempted one final pivot, claiming all transfers were temporary loans to preserve household stability during market uncertainty. Eleanor asked leave for a single question. "Mr. Pike, did you at any point notify beneficiaries in writing that their pension funds had been diverted?" He blustered. "Notification was implied by yes or no. No formal notice. Did you repay diverted sums? Repayment schedules were pending. Yes or no? No." She nodded once. "No further questions." It was not dramatic. It was fatal. The trustees' ruling came at dusk after what felt like another lifetime in hard benches and stale air. By unanimous decision, Schedule B accepted as authentic through duplicates and corroborating testimony. Trust to remain open for full forensic review. Lady Vexley removed immediately from all fiduciary authority over Muller assets. Mr. Pike referred for civil and criminal inquiry into fraudulent diversion. Mr. Rook's engagement claim deemed unenforceable under coercive circumstances, and beneficiary non-consent. Emergency restitution ordered to pension accounts pending final accounting. Lady Vexley did not collapse. She stood very straight while sentence was read, as if posture could still command obedience. Only when the chairman directed that she surrender household account keys, within 48 hours did she truly falter. "You cannot do this to me," she whispered, then louder to the room. "After all I have managed, after all I sacrificed." "No, Lady Vexley," Eleanor said quietly from her table. "After all you took." Rook shoved past reporters and vanished into the rain without hat or farewell. Pike shouted about appeals until a constable took his arm and reminded him, politely, that shouting changed nothing written. Lady Vexley turned once at the doors and met Eleanor's eyes. For a flicker of a second there was naked hatred there, then calculation, already seeking the next angle, but no one moved to follow her. No one offered carriage or comfort. Social exile began not with a proclamation, but with empty space opening around her as people stepped away. Earned, Eleanor thought, and felt no triumph, only release so sharp it hurt. Outside Lincoln's Inn the rain had stopped. The stones shone under a cold strip of evening sky. Eleanor descended the steps on legs that still remembered Mr. Rook's grip, Lady Vexley's voice, the trustee's gavel. At the curb, Tom's mother stood wringing her cap in both hands. She had come to testify and never been called, then waited anyway. "Miss Muller," she said as Eleanor approached, Did it do any good, all this?" Eleanor looked at her, at the chapped hands, the worry carved deep around her mouth, and answered with the first certainty she had allowed herself in days. Yes, it did. Tom's mother let out a breath that seemed to empty months. Then thank God! She pressed Eleanor's gloved fingers once between both of hers and hurried off toward the omnibus, shoulders lighter. Mr. Dane emerged behind Eleanor carrying 2 document boxes and an expression of dazed victory. "Hale says we'll be in audit for months." "Let it be years," Eleanor said. "The numbers can stand sunlight now." Ashbourne came down last, hat in hand, hair wind-tossed for once out of strict order. He stopped 1 step below her, close enough that she could see exhaustion carved beneath his eyes. "You were extraordinary," he said. She gave a short, incredulous laugh. "I was terrified." "I know, and angry." "I know that too." For a moment they stood amid clerks and carriages and no privacy whatsoever. Yet the world seemed to have gone slightly quiet around them. Eleanor looked down at her wrist where Rook had gripped her. A faint red imprint remained. She touched it once, then dropped her hand. "I thought," she said slowly, "that winning would feel like thunder. It feels like silence after machinery stops." Ashbourne nodded. "You have been braced for impact for years. It may take time to notice the absence." Mr. Hale interrupted with practical brutality. Signatures required, temporary receivers to appoint, key inventories to seize before Lady Vexley could burn half the evidence out of spite. Crisis mode tried to reassert itself. Eleanor took the papers, scanned, signed where needed. Her name no longer looked like an apology. When at last the immediate legal swarm thinned, she turned to Ashbourne. "I cannot go back to that house tonight." "You won't." He hesitated. "There is a suite prepared at my sister's former townhouse, staffed, respectable, and entirely yours until you decide otherwise. Mrs. Grant will attend you." "Thank you." The words held more than logistics. He heard it and inclined his head, accepting without claiming. As the carriage door opened, Eleanor paused with one foot on the step. "My father asked you to protect me," she said quietly, not looking at him. "You failed then." "I know. You did not fail today." She got in before he could answer, and the carriage rolled into evening. 3 months later, spring came late and stubborn. In the square behind the old parish schoolhouse on Müller land, damp earth finally gave way to green. Children's voices ricocheted off brick walls where plaster still smelled new. A chalkboard leaned against a bench. 2 boys argued over a slate. A girl with ink on her nose read aloud from a primer while pretending not to enjoy being right. Eleanor stood beneath a budding pear tree with account pages in hand and wind tugging loose strands from her carefully pinned hair. Not severe now, simply practical. She wore no cast-off garnet clasp, only a plain blue ribbon at her throat. "Miss Miller!" Tom, arm long-heeled and now proudly overused, ran up with a crooked wooden ruler. "Mr. Bell says the geometry set is short 1 compass." "Then Mr. Bell may stop frightening compasses into hiding," Eleanor said. "Check the second cabinet, top shelf." Tom grinned and bolted. From the gate came the crunch of gravel. Ashbourne crossed the garden path carrying a flat box tied in twine. He paused to let 2 girls race past him, then came to stand beside Eleanor under the pear tree. "You have been promoted," he said, glancing toward the doorway where Mrs. Grant was pinning lesson schedules. "Tom now obeys you faster than any clerk obeys me. A terrifying development." He handed her the box. Inside lay 6 brass compasses and a new ledger, calf-bound and blank. "For the school," he said, and because the last one was beginning to look as if it had survived cannon fire. She ran a thumb over the fresh leather. "It nearly did." He watched her for a moment, then said, "Walk with me." They moved to the far edge of the garden where currant bushes bordered a low wall. Children's noise softened behind them. Not gone, just distant enough for honesty. Ashbourne stopped. No audience, no legal table, no shield of procedure. "I have rehearsed this badly," he said. Eleanor lifted a brow. "That sounds promising." A faint, self-mocking smile touched his mouth and vanished. "I spent years believing restraint was virtue. It was fear. Fear that if I cared visibly, I would fail visibly. So I chose distance and called it duty." "You made that impossible." He looked at her directly, unflinching. "I love you, Eleanor." The words seemed to startle even him by how simply they arrived. "I loved you, perhaps, before I knew what to do with the fact. In the conservatory, when you lied about Trembling because truth was not safe. In the office, when you read numbers like witness testimony. In the mews, kneeling in mud with a boy's broken arm, while every rule of your world told you to stay clean and quiet." He took a breath. "I do not ask for gratitude. I do not deserve rescue credits for standing where I should have stood sooner. I ask, awkwardly, belatedly, whether you can imagine marrying a man still learning how not to retreat when tenderness is required." Eleanor had thought once that if this moment came, she would answer swiftly, cleverly, in a line worthy of memory. Instead, she stood with the new ledger in her hands and felt her pulse leap into her fingertips. Her hands began to tremble. Ashbourne saw it, and for one startled heartbeat, fear crossed his face. "If this is distress, it is not distress," she said, and laughed softly at herself. "Only significance." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a prayer. She set the ledger on the wall and stepped closer. "I cannot promise never to be angry with you," she said. "I expect to be, on occasion, quite professionally. I should worry if you were not. I cannot promise grace every hour. I have seen your grace in harder places than drawing rooms. She lifted her chin. "What I can promise is this. I will not shrink to make you comfortable. I will not be managed into silence. If we do this, we do it as allies." His answer came without hesitation. "Yes. And you must keep speaking plainly. No vanishing into efficiency when feeling would do." A ghost of rueful humour. "That clause may be the most difficult." "Then practice." She reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. "Yes," Eleanor said. No orchestra, no witnesses pressing close, only children shouting over arithmetic and a pear tree threatening blossom. Ashbourne bowed his head once, as if receiving a verdict he had hoped for and not presumed, then lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles with reverence that made her throat ache. When they walked back toward the school door, Tom looked up from his slate, saw their joined hands, and grinned with all the subtlety of a trumpet. "Does this mean Lord Ashbourne has to do sums too?" he called. Eleanor glanced at Ashbourne. "Daily," he sighed. "I have been outmanoeuvred by an institution." By June, Lady Vexley had surrendered the Mayfair keys under court order. Eleanor entered the house once in daylight, with Mr. Hale and an inventory clerk. She stood in the dining room where spoons had chimed against her shaking tray and directed calmly the removal of her father's portrait back above the mantel. "Centred, please," she said as the footman lifted it. "He disliked crooked things." In Holborn, Mr. Rooke put his townhouse on let and removed to a hunting estate in Norfolk with suspicious haste. Society called it a desire for country air. Society was generous that way when men fled consequences. Mr. Pike, denied bail after contradictory statements multiplied under audit, discovered that charm did little against arithmetic in court. Edwin Marsh survived, though headaches kept him from fine copying. Eleanor arranged a modest post for him in the school office, where his shaky hand could still keep honest attendance books. He wept when told, and tried to refuse charity. She told him it was not charity. It was restitution with employment terms. At Ashbourne's main office, a new brass plate appeared on the correspondence room door. "Miss Eleanor Müller, Director. Charitable accounts and tenant endowments." Mr. Dane polished it twice the first day and pretended not to. On an August morning, sunlight striped the long table where ledgers lay open. Eleanor stood at its head while two junior clerks waited, pens ready. "No rounding," she said, tapping a column. "If a pensioner is owed 8 shillings, record 8 shillings. Poverty lives there." Both clerks nodded and corrected the line. From the doorway, Ashbourne watched her for a moment, then set a fresh tray of tea on the sideboard himself, because the servants were occupied upstairs. Cups rattled faintly as he poured. Eleanor looked over at the sound. Their eyes met. He raised one brow in silent question. She crossed the room, took her cup, and realized her hands were trembling again, just a little from heat and happiness, and the absurdity of peace. Ashbourne's voice was low, familiar now. "Why are you trembling?" Eleanor curled her fingers around the china, felt the tremor, and smiled without looking away. "I am trembling," she said.